You have seen the palaces. In films about Jesus, in illustrated Bibles, in paintings hung in museums for centuries, marble columns rising toward painted ceilings, golden lampstands catching firelight, servants moving silently through halls that gleam. That is the image. But what was Herod's palace actually like in 30 AD Jerusalem? Not the throne room during a royal audience, not the banquet hall prepared for dignitaries, the palace as it was lived in, day after day, by the powerful and by those who served them. Behind the perfume and polished stone was a different reality. Waste that had to go somewhere. Tension that never lifted. Secrets the elite worked carefully to conceal. The marble was real. So was what it concealed. This is not about miracles or theological debates. This is about the physical world of power in Roman Judea. How it looked, how it smelled, what it cost to maintain, and who paid that cost. What you will discover is how luxury and filth existed not in opposition, but side by side, inseparable. Herod the Great did not build palaces for comfort alone. He built them to intimidate, to demonstrate loyalty to Rome, to prove that even in the Judean desert, he could rival the emperor himself. And he succeeded. When you entered one of Herod's palaces, whether in Jerusalem, Jericho, or Masada, you entered a space designed to overwhelm. Imported marble lined the walls, not local limestone, not Judean stone. Marble shipped from quarries across the Mediterranean, white from Greece, colored veins from Egypt and Asia Minor. The floors were mosaics, geometric patterns in black and white, occasionally images, rarely human figures, as that would offend Jewish sensibilities in Jerusalem, but floral designs, intricate borders, optical illusions in stone. The ceilings were painted, frescoes imitating expensive materials, false marble, false wood grain, false gold leaf. Where actual gold was used, it was applied in thin sheets, burnished until it reflected lamplight like liquid fire. These were not Judean building techniques. These were Roman, imported not just in material, but in method. Herod employed craftsmen from across the empire, mosaicists from Syria, fresco painters from Italy, marble workers from Greece. The message was clear. This was not a Jewish king accommodating Rome. This was a Roman governor who happened to be Jewish. But marble in the desert requires maintenance. Dust penetrated everything. Fine particles blown from the Judean hills settled on polished surfaces daily. Servants wiped and re-wiped columns, floors, and decorative inlays to preserve the illusion of permanence. Water was scarce, yet marble had to be washed. Mosaics had to be scrubbed. Frescoes could not be cleaned aggressively, or the paint would flake. The palace complex in Jerusalem was not a single structure. It was a compound, multiple buildings connected by courtyards, private chambers for the family, guest quarters for visiting dignitaries, barracks for guards, service buildings for kitchens, storage, and workshops. Archaeologists have uncovered portions of what is believed to be Herod's Jerusalem palace, now buried beneath the modern Old City, near the Jaffa Gate. The scale is staggering. Walls several meters thick, foundations that required cutting into bedrock, columns that would have stood 3 times the height of a man. The expense was not in gold alone. It was in labor. Stone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and lifted into place. Floors had to be laid one tiny tile at a time. Frescoes required scaffolding, layers of plaster, and pigments ground by hand. And all of this, every surface, every decoration, had to be maintained. Herod's architecture was not simply impressive. It was a continuous assertion of control. Control over resources, control over labor, control over the visual language of power itself. To stand in one of these halls was to understand immediately. You were in the presence of someone who commanded more than soldiers. He commanded stone, he commanded color, he commanded light. But architecture cannot mask everything. Beneath the marble, something else was always present. Human beings lived here, ate here, slept here, disposed of waste here, and no amount of polished stone could make that disappear. The wealthy of the ancient world lived with a constant problem: smell. No refrigeration existed. Meat spoiled within hours in the Judean heat. Human waste, even when removed, left traces. Bodies sweated through wool and linen. Cooking smoke clung to fabric and hair. And in a palace crowded with hundreds of people, family, guests, servants, guards, the odors compounded. The solution was perfume, not a luxury, a necessity. Frankincense and myrrh were burned constantly in bronze censers. The resins smoldered, releasing thick, sweet smoke that drifted through corridors and settled into tapestries. Imported oils were applied to skin, hair, and clothing. Spikenard from the Himalayas, balsam from Engedi, rose oil from Persia, cinnamon oil from Arabia. These were not subtle scents. They were heavy, cloying, designed to dominate the senses so completely that nothing else could penetrate. A single alabaster jar of pure nard could cost 300 denarii, a year's wages for a laborer. That was not extravagance. That was investment in social standing. To smell of fine oil was to announce wealth. To burn expensive incense was to demonstrate control over trade routes spanning thousands of miles. But perfume served another function. It masked. The latrine pit beneath the servant quarters, the kitchen courtyard where animal carcasses were butchered, the storage rooms where olive oil went rancid in clay jars. The wealthy did not smell these things because they moved through clouds of scent that preceded them and lingered after they passed. Servants applied perfume to their masters' bodies after bathing. They rubbed it into beards. They scented the hems of garments so that every movement released fragrance. In the Gospel accounts, perfume appears repeatedly. The woman who anoints Jesus' feet with costly nard, the criticism that follows. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? That was not rhetorical exaggeration. That was the actual market value. Perfume was liquid wealth, portable, stable. It did not spoil like grain or corrode like metal. A jar of fine oil could be traded, inherited, or sold in crisis. Wealthy families stored it alongside gold. But in Herod's palace, perfume was not stored. It was deployed. Every public space reeked of it. Receiving halls, dining chambers, even the courtyards where guests gathered under colonnades. Archaeologists excavating Herodian sites have found small stone vessels, likely for perfumed oils, and bronze stands for incense burners. These were not decorative, they were infrastructure. The palace operated on a perfume economy. Servants were tasked with keeping censers lit, oil lamps were scented, water used for hand washing was infused with crushed petals or herbs. And yet, despite all this, the smell was never entirely gone. Because perfume does not eliminate odor, it layers over it. Beneath the frankincense and myrrh, beneath the rose oil and spikenard, the smells of daily life persisted. Sweat, waste, decay. The elite simply stopped noticing. Their senses had been trained from childhood to recognize only the top notes, the expensive ones. But the servants knew. They moved between the perfumed halls and the service areas where no incense burned. They smelled both worlds, and they understood what the marble and the oils were really for. Not beauty, not holiness, concealment. The palace was a stage. The perfume was part of the performance, and like all performances, it required constant work to maintain. The palace had another layer, one that guests never saw. Beneath the marble floors and perfumed halls ran a network of channels, cisterns, and storage chambers. A hidden infrastructure that made elite life possible. This was not decoration. This was engineering. Water had to be stored. Waste had to be removed. Food had to be kept as cool as possible in a climate that spoiled meat within hours. The systems were Roman in design, adapted for Judean conditions. Herod's architects understood that luxury required plumbing. Cisterns were cut into bedrock beneath the palace complex, massive chambers that collected rainwater during the brief winter months. The walls were plastered with waterproof lime coating, a technique imported from Rome. Water flowed through channels carved into stone. Clay pipes connected buildings. Lead piping was used in critical areas, though sparingly. It was expensive and required specialized labor. The wealthy bathed, not daily as in Rome, but regularly. Heated water was carried in bronze vessels. The runoff drained into channels that led away from residential areas. But bathing water was the least of the drainage problems. Human waste was produced daily by hundreds of people. The elite used chamber pots. Servants emptied them into collection areas far from living quarters. The waste was either buried in pits outside the complex or carried beyond the city walls. In some Herodian palaces, particularly Masada, archaeologists have found latrines with stone seats positioned over deep shafts. The waste fell into pits that could be sealed and abandoned when full. But in Jerusalem, space was limited. The palace complex was surrounded by the city. There was no endless desert to absorb refuse. Waste removal became a logistical operation. Designated laborers, the lowest status workers, hauled refuse through back passages that servants used. These corridors were narrow, undecorated, and unlit except by oil lamps. The elite never walked them. They did not know they coexisted. Guests moved through the front halls, where marble gleamed and incense burned. Meanwhile, behind thin walls, laborers carried excrement in sealed jars toward disposal points outside the complex. Kitchen waste was another matter. Animal bones, vegetable scraps, rancid oil, rotting grain. Some of it was fed to dogs or pigs kept in service areas. Some was burned in pits. But burning organic waste produces smoke, thick, acrid smoke that could not be allowed to drift into the residential quarters. So kitchen courtyards were positioned downwind. Servants worked in spaces where the smell of burning refuse mixed with the smell of cooking food. They lived with it. They had no choice. The wealthy, meanwhile, reclined in dining halls where the air smelled of myrrh and roasted meat brought directly from the kitchen, never through the spaces where the carcass had been butchered. Cleanliness in a Herodian palace was not about hygiene, it was about visibility. If the elite did not see it, it did not exist. If they did not smell it, it was not a problem. The infrastructure made that possible. Channels carried waste where eyes would not follow. Servants moved through passages that had no windows. Cisterns stored water in chambers that remained cool and dark year-round. This was not accidental. It was designed. Every palace Herod built included this hidden layer. Masada had it. Jericho had it. Jerusalem had it. The archaeology is consistent. Beneath the public grandeur was a maze of practical, unglamorous systems that required constant labor to maintain. Channels had to be cleaned, cisterns had to be inspected for cracks, waste pits had to be emptied before they overflowed. None of this appeared in official records. None of it was celebrated in inscriptions. But without it, the palace would have been uninhabitable. The marble would still gleam. The frescoes would still impress. But the smell would betray the illusion. And so, the hidden infrastructure remained hidden, not because it was shameful, because it was necessary. And necessity, in the world of the powerful, was something best kept out of sight. For every person who reclined on a cushioned couch, someone else carried the couch into place. For every alabaster jar of perfume opened, someone else had transported it from a distant port. For every marble floor that gleamed, someone else had scrubbed it on their knees. The palace did not run itself. It required bodies, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, depending on the season and the number of guests. Servants, slaves, laborers hired by the day. They were the invisible machinery of elite life, and their world bore no resemblance to the one their masters inhabited. Most servants lived in the back sections of the palace complex, rooms barely large enough to lie down in, no windows, no ventilation except what came through doorways. In summer, these spaces became ovens. Stone walls absorbed heat during the day and radiated it at night. Sleep was difficult. In winter, they were cold. Servants were not provided with braziers or extra blankets. Body heat and shared space were the only insulation. The work began before dawn. Water carriers rose first. Cisterns had to be accessed. Jars had to be filled and hauled to kitchens, bathing areas, and guest chambers. A single large ceramic jar, when full, weighed as much as a small child. Carriers moved with them balanced on shoulders or heads, walking carefully on stone floors slick with condensation. Kitchens came alive next. Fires had to be lit. Bread dough prepared the night before had to be shaped and baked. Meat had to be butchered if a banquet was planned. Cooks worked in smoke-filled courtyards. There were no chimneys in ancient Judean kitchens. Smoke rose and dispersed as it could. Eyes watered. Lungs became scarred over years of inhaling it daily. Chamber servants entered the private quarters of the family only when summoned. They carried fresh water for washing. They removed chamber pots, sealed, but never perfectly sealed. This was considered women's work, or the work of the youngest slaves, those without status even among the unfree. No one spoke of it. It simply had to be done. Latrine cleaners worked in the waste channels beneath the palace. They cleared blockages. They hauled sealed containers of excrement to disposal points beyond the complex. They were untouchable in the social order. Not formally, Judaism had no caste system like India, but practically, no one who cleaned latrines was invited to eat with others. No one who handled waste was allowed near food preparation. They lived in the furthest corners of the servant quarters. They were paid the least. Often they were not paid at all, just given food and a place to sleep. Body servants had higher status. These were the attendants who applied perfumed oils, arranged clothing, and stood silently during meals in case they were needed. They were chosen for appearance and demeanor. They had to be pleasant to look at and utterly quiet unless addressed. Their bodies became extensions of their master's will. They anticipated needs. They moved without being told. They learned to read moods from posture and tone. This required intelligence. It also required the suppression of self. A body servant who showed emotion, annoyance, fatigue, disgust could be dismissed, or beaten, or sold. So they learned not to show anything. The division between the perfumed halls and the servant areas was absolute. Servants entered the elite spaces only to work. They did not linger. They did not speak unless questioned. When they returned to their own quarters, they carried the smell of expensive oils on their hands and the ache of labor in their backs. They ate differently. Plain bread, lentils, occasionally meat scraps from banquets, but only what the guests had not touched and the kitchen staff had not claimed first. They wore coarse linen or wool, undyed, unadorned, functional. Their clothing had to be clean enough not to offend, but worn enough to signal status. A servant dressed too well invited suspicion. Where did they get such fabric? They aged faster than the elite, backs bent from carrying, knees damaged from kneeling on stone, hands scarred from hot cookware and rough cleaning tools. Women who spent years hauling water developed shoulders like laborers. Men who worked in kitchens lost their sense of smell from constant smoke, and yet they were essential. Without them, the marble would dull. The perfume would run out. The waste would pile up. The palace would collapse into disarray within days. The elite knew this. But knowing did not translate into gratitude. Servants were infrastructure, like cisterns, like drainage channels, necessary, invisible. Replace able. When one grew too old or too injured to work, another took their place. There was always another. The powerful reclined on couches and discussed philosophy, politics, theology. The servants stood behind them, silent, holding wine jugs. And when the night ended and the guests retired, the servants remained, cleaning, resetting, preparing for the next day. The palace never rested, neither did they. Herod's palace was not merely a residence. It was a fortress, a stage, a prison. Political power in Roman Judea was never secure. Alliances shifted. Loyalties were questioned. Enemies emerged from within families as often as from rival factions. Herod the Great understood this. He built his palaces accordingly. Thick walls, guarded gates, courtyards that could be sealed, private chambers accessible only through narrow passages that could be watched. This was not paranoia. This was survival. Herod had ordered the execution of his own wife, his own sons, anyone he suspected of conspiracy. By 30 AD, Herod the Great was long dead, but his sons ruled in his image. Herod Antipas governed Galilee and Perea. Herod Archelaus had ruled Judea until Rome removed him. Herod Philip controlled territories to the north. The palace in Jerusalem remained a center of power. Roman prefects used it. Herodian officials passed through it. High priests negotiated within its halls. Every conversation was calculated. Every banquet was theater. Guests reclined on couches, eating delicacies, discussing matters of state. But beneath the surface, everyone was watching everyone else. Who spoke to whom? Who avoided whom? Who drank too much and said too much? Information was currency. A careless word could end a career or a life. Servants witnessed everything. They stood behind couches, refilling wine cups. They lingered near doorways, waiting to be summoned. They moved silently through rooms where secrets were traded, and they remembered. Some were informants, paid by rival factions to report what they heard. Others were simply afraid, aware that silence was safer than repeating the wrong thing to the wrong person. The palace operated under constant surveillance, not formal, not organized like a modern state, but relentless. Family members spied on each other. Advisors reported to multiple masters. Even friendships were transactional. Herod the Great had imprisoned relatives in his palace at Masada. He had held them there not for crimes committed, but for crimes he imagined they might commit. His sons learned from him. Trust no one, control everything, appear generous while remaining ruthless. Banquets were opportunities for political maneuvering. Invitations signaled favor. Seating arrangements communicated hierarchy. To be excluded was to be marked. To be seated far from the host was a public humiliation. And everyone noticed. The tension never lifted. Even in private chambers, the elite could not fully relax. Poison was not common, but the fear of it was. Food tasters were employed. Wine was observed being poured. Doors were locked from the inside at night. The palace was beautiful. It was also exhausting. Beneath the marble and perfume was a world where power devoured those who wielded it. Herod the Great had died in agony, his body rotting from disease, his mind consumed by suspicion. His sons ruled under Roman oversight, their authority conditional, their legitimacy always in question. By the time Jesus entered Jerusalem, the palace was a monument to instability disguised as strength. The marble still gleamed, the incense still burned, but those who lived there knew the truth. Power was not security. Wealth was not safety. Every alliance was temporary. Every conversation was a gamble. And the hidden filth, the waste, the labor, the violence required to maintain the illusion was never truly hidden. It was simply ignored. Because to acknowledge it would be to admit that the entire structure was fragile, that the palace, for all its grandeur, was built on bodies and sustained by fear. Herod's palace was not simply a building. It was a stage where power, faith, and survival collided daily. Marble concealed channels of waste. Perfume masked the smell of fear. Servants made luxury possible while remaining invisible. Next time, we step outside these walls into Jerusalem's streets where the real majority lived. Subscribe. Keep exploring history as it was actually lived.